player looking to improve your performance and mobility but aren't sure where to start, I'm going to go over today the squat and hinge assessment that I use for baseball players, because those are two foundational movements that we need to be able to do properly and correctly for maximum lower body force production, which in turn leads to higher throwing velocity. How do I know this? My name is Dr. Jeff Lewis. I'm the owner and physical therapist of Lewis Physical Therapy and Sports Rehab in Point Pleasant, New Jersey, and I have helped countless baseball players, primarily pitchers, get stronger and back to throwing pain-free after an injury. So again, I want to go over today the squat and hip hinge process that I use, or evaluation process that I use for any baseball player that comes into our clinic. And you might be saying, well, okay, if you're coming for an arm injury, why are we looking at their lower body mechanics for a squat and a hip hinge? You throw with your lower body, not your arm. If you throw all with your arm, you're just asking for yourself to get hurt. It doesn't matter how strong of an arm you have. If you, every time you go out there and you just think, I'm just going to throw as hard as I can with my arm or my shoulder, that is going to catch up to you at some point. So this is why I look at lower body mechanics specifically for the squat pattern and the hip hinge pattern. For pitchers specifically, every time that you push up, that you push off the mound, you're essentially doing a single leg squat. And that's going to be through a knee flexion angle like that, but also you're hinging into that back hip. So what we don't want, we don't ever want to see, is guys that just fall forward like this. You now have no power from your back leg really more than anything. So that hip hinge is being able to get back into your hip like that as you go down. So we're going to start with the squat pattern more than anything. So I always have guys take their shoes off, mainly because I want to try to get as good of an idea of what their just stability looks like more than anything from a barefoot position. And I'll tell them to start, just give me, we'll just say right now, give me 5 just double leg squats. I tell guys, go with what you feel comfortable from a standpoint. Like, again, not everyone should be able to squat. Not everyone should be able to or try to squat with their feet straight ahead. Majority of people's hips are just not made up to be able to support that, and you're probably not going to be able to get an effective squat out of it. So I just tell guys, again, go ahead and squat whatever is a comfortable distance and width for you, and I'll take note of it. If a guy is like super out here when they squat, some things are starting to go off in my head, like, okay, we need to look at hip mobility, maybe a little bit more, ankle mobility. What's a limiting factor here? So we'll have them start here, arms out in front, and I'll have them squat down, really just to what's comfortable. Now, if they get down here and they collapse forward like that, again, some things are starting to go off in my head where I'm like, okay, they're not really able to keep very good trunk stability as they get down that bottom position. So is it a matter of, as they come down here, is it because they don't have the ankle mobility to come forward? Is it they run out of room in their hips, so it all has to come from their low back? Do they not have the extension in their back to do that? So there's 3 different areas right there if we're just looking at one squat. Is there an ankle mobility issue? Is there a hip mobility issue? Is it a just back strength issue? They can't hold that, or back mobility. So the next thing I'll do then is I'll have them really just focus on their hands go behind their head here. And I tell them, listen, I want you to keep your elbows up the entire time. Okay, so we want to keep our elbows up. We don't want them to dip down. So we'll start here, and then I'll go and hold this position up here, and then they squat down for me, and then they squat up. So if that is then a matter of, hey, they can hold that position there a little, they can get to a better depth, and with their elbows up there, that helps create a more just, we'll just say, satisfactory, efficient squat. That's a good cue for us where, hey, it might just be an awareness thing where when I have my elbows up like that and I have to try to keep them up, I'm naturally going to kick on my back extensors to keep a more of an upright position more than anything. Okay, now, if they get to the point where they're up here and they're super far back like that, and now I'm collapsing forward, well, it doesn't matter how much I keep my elbows up, I'm still really not in a good position here. And if those knees really just don't track over the toes, then I'm going to start to go look into their ankle mobility. So ankle dorsiflexion. And ankle dorsiflexion is the ability for that knee to move forward and past those toes with keeping your heel on the ground. We need to be able to have that knee go past our toe. And now listen, I'm going to preface this with saying guys that have flared up knees, I'm not going to force that motion, be a little more mindful of it, but we want to be able to have certain hip flexion range of motion there more than anything, okay? I'm sorry, have certain ankle range of motion there. And then if that's the case where, hey, they can keep good alignment here, but they just don't have the mobility in their hips, they're like, wow, I'm getting really pinchy there more than anything, then I'm going to maybe take them to the table. I'm going to look at their hip flexion range of motion, so the ability for that hip to come straight up, internal rotation for that hip to internally rotate with that foot coming out, and external rotation as well. So that's really just a quick rundown of, hey, how do we take a guy through a squat assessment? what are we looking for, and the different avenues that we'll go through. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is the hip hinge pattern. So the difference with the hip hinge versus the squat is a squat, you're going to have equal movement throughout your knees and your hips together. Still a hip hinge in there, but it's going to be more of like you're sitting straight down. With a hip hinge, this is a predominantly hip-based movement. So what I want to be able to see for guys is, again, their feet are in their normal position, whatever they feel comfortable with. You have a slight knee bend, and I want to really tell them, keep that knee bend. I don't want those knees to straighten back, but I don't want them to come forward. So as they're here, they're going to really sit their hip back as their trunk's coming forward, and then I'm going to stand up. Some common issues that I see. The first thing is the back position. As they come down, do they collapse at their back like this? Okay, so that's one thing. And that could be, do they just not have the back strength, the awareness, a couple different things like that. The second part is, now I'm going down to look at the knees. Do the knees come too far forward? Does it turn into more of a squat? So I have that slight knee bend again, and as I'm coming down, it's turning into that squat there. So again, is that a matter of they don't necessarily have great posterior chain flexibility, or is it just an awareness thing where they don't even realize they're doing it? Because most guys just naturally don't know how to hip hinge unless they're taught. And then the second part is, hey, if they bend their knee, are they moving so far back as they go down? Those knees are now moving behind our ankles there. And that's just going to put a lot more stress on that lower, on really just that posterior chain more than anything, versus keeping it at the hip. So again, really with this, what I want to look for, and I might give someone a dowel to hold behind their back. So the way that that would look, and again, I'll say this, the dowel is just for a training purpose. Like, this is not going to be what I'm not going to have someone just do a dowel during their strength programs. They're not going to get any stimulus. But you're going to have the dowel behind their back. I want you to think about having 3 points of contact. So top of the head, or back of the head, excuse me, mid-back, and tailbone. So I have slight knee bend, and as I'm sitting back, I'm keeping those 3 points of contact throughout that dowel. What I don't want is, if I'm rounded forward, it pops up here. If I arch too much, it pops off there. And if I drop my head, it pops off there. So I want to keep 3 points of contact that entire time that we're going through. So once we have a good idea of, hey, what does their squat look like? Or what does their squat or their hinge look like? What cues can we give them that helps improve that? When we find out what helps improve it or what they're deficient in, then we can build a bit more of an effective program for, hey, what mobility corrective exercise do we need to do for them on a day-to-day or every other day basis? And then what modifications do we need to make from a lifting standpoint? So if a guy does not have the, if a guy does not have the ability to, as they get into a back squat, to keep the tension throughout their back, and they just come down here every time like that, well, I'm probably not going to load them up a ton with put the barbell on their back, because all we're going to do there is probably just make that pattern worse. And now we're just going to put a lot more stress on the low back more than anything. I'm not saying to not train it. You certainly can. You just maybe don't put it up. You just maybe do it as a warm up from an isometric standpoint. Some pause squats, some tempoed squats, super lightweight to groove that pattern. But then maybe I'm giving them a heavy kettlebell where they have to hold it in front, and I'm just going into a goblet squat here, holding and going down. So they really just force that upright position. And then from an RDL standpoint, again, I might not go right to giving them a barbell for an RDL. I might just give them a kettlebell and go from just one kettlebell in front here, and then they go down to the hinge and stand up. There's a lot of different progressions there, but it's not a matter of saying, hey, we're not going to train that pattern. We're just going to find a more appropriate exercise within their current limitations in that pattern specifically. So if you have a question on how we can evaluate a certain squat or hinge pattern, or about your specific squat or hinge pattern, leave a comment below. You can like us, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We put out a ton of weekly content on baseball player rehab and performance training.